Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who, as you well know, has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Now, in this video, we're gonna finally talk about gender, and I feel like, adding here in this Bill Burr's voice, oh Jesus. So yeah, we'll try to kind of tackle this, 100 million year problem here in this, I don't know, half an hour - 1 hour video. I don't know. Depends on, how far I'm going to be digressing. So just a couple of caveats before we begin. So for the purposes of this video, I would mean the terms gender and sex interchangeably. Well, probably, if I call this video Understanding Sex, there would have been some misunderstandings possible. And, we're not going to use this cheap clickbait, etc. And then I'm going to use the terms male, female, and man and woman also interchangeably because, well, in many occasions they are, especially if we're talking about, human species. And probably the most important caveat is that I'm going to be talking about generalizations, about the population in general, right? So I'm going to be talking about, roughly speaking, an average man and average woman, or the statistical distributions thereof. Whereas I completely understand if say, your aunt, has a little mustache and she can, change a truck tire in 1 minute, etc., etc. Yeah, not all women are close to the average, right? There are outliers. Not all men are close to the average, etc. We'll discuss that a little bit later. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about generalizations. And the source of the following material is pretty much the evolutionary theory of gender by Armenian Soviet scientist Geodakan, which was proposed in 1965, I think. And also a lot of materials from the so-called MGTOW community, right? Men going their own way. So if you've heard the names like Barbarossa, Stardust, Coltrane, TFM, etc., probably maybe 80% of the material to be presented below would be familiar to you. But I would still try to build a coherent narrative, from the very basics, from the philosophy, so to speak. And here we would need this evolutionary theory of gender. So, all right, so let's jump right to it, right? Let's jump right to it, I should have said. All right, so when we're talking about gender, well, first thing we should talk about really is life itself, right? What is life, how it is built, etc., etc. Now, I'm gonna try to give my own definition for what life is later in other videos when we're gonna be discussing alien life, possible alien life. But here, I just want to mention that probably the most ultimate manifestation, or rather foundation of life, is the genetic code, right? It's the most basic unit from which everything else basically stems. All the cells and organs and whatever tissues are just the manifestations of this basic genetic code. All right, so given that, what kind of problems are there for the genetic code? So I believe there are two problems, and they are inherently contradicting each other, right? So you can't solve both of them simultaneously. And those are the necessity to conserve, to sustain yourself, so to speak, and the necessity to adapt, to change a little bit, right? So the genetic code has these two basic problems of the necessity to conserve itself and the necessity to change itself in order to adapt to changing conditions of the environment or whatever. And as you might guess, if you have this contradiction inside of your organism, some problems would be observed, right? If you have a very simple organism, say a bacteria, it's not a big problem really, you can more or less cope with that. But if you have a very complex organism, like complex multicellular organism, then probably keeping this contradiction in each cell of your organism is not very healthy thing to do, right? So that's, and this is like one of my foundational points here in this video, is that this is exactly where gender kicks in, right? So gender is a way of solving this contradiction, this very basic contradiction of life, by removing this contradiction from the level of the organism to the level of the population, right? So when we have many similar organisms, many organisms of the same species, we can theoretically create a certain division of labor, if you like. So one part of the population would be responsible for focusing more on the task of conservation, and the other part of the population would be focusing more on the task of adaptation, of change, you know. And therefore, if you take any single organism, it would be kind of like, you know, at least part of this contradiction would be removed from it into the whole population, and therefore the organism would be more stable, each separate organism in this population. And I believe that gender is exactly that. It's the way of solving this basic contradiction. So now you might ask, well, okay, which gender represents the part of that conserves the genetic information, and which one represents the part that is more about adaptation, you know, change, mutations, etc. And it's not obvious like from the first principles, but I think all the available data clearly states that the gender that is about conservation is female, and the gender that is about change and adaptivity is male, right? And it's really like, in a way you can say that female gender, the one which is about conservation, it's about numbers, you know, quantity, right? Because, well, if you just look at how nature works, like really females, they give birth, etc., etc. So they're about quantity, they're about numbers, the you know, extensive size of the population, whereas a male gender is more about quality, it's about adaptation, right? So we can, to a certain degree, we can state that actually evolution, you know, the natural selection happens in the male part of the population, like females are not really involved in that process. So it's males who suffer from all the downfalls of the selection process. And they also, you could say at least a certain fraction of them benefit from that same process also. But we'll see some examples later. But here I wish to give some like really biological examples which are quite striking in my opinion. And in particular, there is a phenomenon in some species where they can actually change their gender, right? Or again, sex or whatever. Like one good example is this cottonwood tree, you know, that tree that would, you know, send all these stupid snow seeds, so to speak, about a month later. So the gender of the tree that sends all those seeds is obviously female, right? So if you have that tree that produces all those seeds, which is female, and you say you damage it a little bit, like you cut a couple of branches, what would happen is that this tree would actually turn into a male cottonwood tree, which is quite fascinating, right? But even more interesting, if you damage it even more, like if you just leave basically a trunk and a couple of branches, it's gonna turn into female again. And like, I think you should appreciate my generosity here. Like I'm leaving out the possibility to make a joke about, you know, removing some limbs and make you a female from a male, etc. Then another example would be like pruning or tipping, you know, like cucumbers, etc. So what usually happens is that like male flowers appear first, but if you prune the cucumber, that is, you damage it, right? Then male flowers appear first. I'm sorry, female. And that is pretty interesting. And what it allows you to do in terms of agriculture is get harvest sooner, right? Because female flowers are the ones that give you the harvest, basically. Other interesting examples would be, I'm not sure if it's known in the Western world, but in the USSR, for example, there have been a pretty prominent practice when people treated, or maybe mistreated, some plants, I mean agricultural plants in the greenhouses, etc., with carbon monoxide. And what happened then was that, again, more female flowers appeared, which allowed you to increase your harvests, increase decrease the time before harvest, etc. So, but that's not all. There's another interesting example with Mississippi alligator, for example. Like, actually, the gender of an alligator directly depends on the temperature of the nest, like, when the egg hatches, etc. So it has been noted that if the temperature is above 34 Celsius, you get most of the alligators produced are male. But if the temperature is below 30, I think all of them are female. But if the temperature is somewhere in between, like 30 to 34, you get some mix of males and females. All right, and it might happen in the same nest, actually. So if, say, in the center of the nest you have a higher temperature but a lower temperature at the rim, at the edges, you will have more male alligators in the center and more female alligators at the edges, which is also quite interesting. So what do we observe in all these examples is exactly that, in my opinion, the just a direct manifestation of this basic biology, this basic contradiction, and then the solving of this contradiction through the means of gender. In particular, if we have a small change in environmental conditions, like, say, a small temperature change, a small damage to the cottonwood tree, etc., then more males are produced exactly because males are needed to cope with the adaptation, to, change a little bit. Male are more flexible, genetically speaking. They have more mutations, etc. Whereas if you damage if you change the environmental conditions so much that it can be perceived as a genuine catastrophe, when the whole existence of the species is under question, then more females would appear, because you need numbers. You need to at least, remain in decent quantity for the next generation to even exist, That, therefore, more females are produced in these catastrophic conditions. And actually, there have been some examples with human species of the same type, like, for example, people who have long periods of, involuntary celibacy, so to speak, they tend to produce more females afterwards. Which means that, the organism perceives, in particular the male organism, because that's the organism that determines, the chromosomal content of the sperm. So the organism perceives this as a catastrophe, there might be not enough females, etc. So more females are produced in the next generation. Now, how exactly that happens is a good question, but it's not a topic of my current video. So I guess actually Gyodakan himself, the scientist who proposed this theory, he actually comes a bit further. He actually directly states that the current form of a male that you have in your population is actually kind of like the future of the population as a whole, whereas a female is kind of like the past of this population, So he kind of proposed that there is this, like, slow drift of all the parameters towards the male side, you know, and that's how evolution works essentially. Well, that might be the case, but I don't know. It's kind of doubtful. Like for example, one good example might be, you know, the size. Like, you know, human males are bigger than human females, which means that according to Gynocentrism, the evolution happens towards getting bigger in size in humans, at least, right? There are some species where you don't see such a difference. There are some species where females are bigger, which means, according to Gynocentrism, that the evolution goes backwards. Well, not genuinely backwards, in the sense that the species becomes smaller, right? That's what I'm saying. All right, and we actually know that you know, the humans from the couple of centuries ago have been smaller than the present day humans. So maybe there's some good point in that, but I don't know, to be honest. I think I can draw a couple of, you know, like poetic analogies here. It's not, maybe not entirely relevant, but I think, you know, it might give some other angle to look at this whole issue. So one of the analogies I would propose is that, you know, like the conservation of the genotype, which is, you know, the female's part in the population. It's more about time, you know. It's a projection of the population onto time. Whereas the adaptation, the change, it's more like a projection of the population on space. You know, I'm trying to utilize these most basic concepts that humans have of time and space. So, again, poetically speaking, you might say that a projection of a human population onto time, which is female, it's almost like an infinite, you know, line, like a spine, you know, some infinite thread going from, you know, infinity backwards to infinity forwards, and these are females, right? But males on the same projection, they would look like almost, they wouldn't have any dimension, you know. It's like a dot, like a bright flash that appears here and there, but it doesn't really present there. It's the females who conserve the genetics, the genotype, basically. So I would say that, you know, like, you could poetically say that men don't really exist, men kind of happen. Whereas, you know, females are women, they are kind of eternal in that sense. So there's a good saying that, at least in the MGTOW community, that men are human doings, whereas, you know, women are human beings. So it's the women who are, and men are just, you know, some accidents, so to speak. But if you look at the spatial projection, you would see the inverse situation, where you have a man who is essentially infinite. He can kind of grasp the whole universe, you know, he can contain the whole universe, conceptualize the whole universe. Man is all about, you know, going outside into the external world, so he's kind of the size of the world, whereas, you know, a female is absolutely self-centered. So she is like a dot in this projection of spatial projection. But that's all kind of poetry. You could also say that women represent like order and men represent chaos, you know, because women are this organized part which is stable, whereas men is this mutable part which is chaotic inherently, right? And or you can, there's another analogy that I really like, is that you can perceive this sort of external layer of the population, right? Whereas the external layer that directly interacts with the environment and adapts to it, right? And suffers from that process. Whereas a female part, women, they represent this internal core of the population that and you get this kind of a two-step process in a way, where men kind of throw themselves into the environment, right? And they try to adapt to it because, okay, I'll talk about it a little bit later. So they try to adapt to it. Many men die in the process, etc., etc. The selection kicks in. So men form some hierarchies or whatever. So the men who are of the best adaptive capabilities, they are at the top of the hierarchy, whereas all the, you know, less fitted men, they're at the very bottom. That's the first phase of the process. And the second phase is when females move in, and they already see all these established hierarchies, and they already move into the external world, which is made comfortable for them by men, right? And they choose, like, they choose just all these guys from the top, you know, who are the best, who have the best parameters for to be adapted to these environmental conditions that we're in. And yeah, so I've already mentioned that like many men die, right, in this process of adaptation. So again, the mortality rates kind of unambiguously tell us that the men are actually the part of the population that provides adaptation, right? Because, well, otherwise men wouldn't die in such great numbers. And so, like, you probably know that in like normal conditions, there are like 5% more males, right? So this is kind of a normal level of inflation, so to speak, right? We have some extra males that we can lose, and everything pretty much would be good nevertheless. And again, we also know that by the age of 20 or about so, we indeed lose these men, right? But there's another part that's kind of frequently missed here, is that if you look at the conception, actually the proportion is much bigger, like almost like 130 to 180 men get conceived, you know, per 100 women. It's just that the majority of all the, you know, unhappy pregnancies, so to speak, you know, miscarriages and whatever, are male. So this selection starts already at the moment of conception. So it's a pretty dramatic point in favor of this, you know, idea that it's actually male who are more mutable. They represent the attempt of the population to adapt, whereas females, women, represent the attempt of a population to proceed, as it were, right, to conserve itself. Yeah. And there was a point that I said that I'm gonna mention it later, but I kind of forgot it. Never mind. And there are many properties of that dynamics which follow from that, and they manifest themselves. This is kind of like a basic biological level, right? But they keep manifesting themselves up to the upper portions of our culture, I would say. Like, one of the things which is easily noticeable is the passiveness of women, you know, the so-called hypoagency, whereas women tend to, well, since it's the men who are interacting with the environment, right? It's the men who get all the resources, you know, produce the resources, take them from nature in raw form or whatever, all types of resources, like the intellectual resources, the whatever. So since the men are the guys handling the resources, not without victims, obviously. I mean, a lot of men die in the process. But women receive those resources from the already established hierarchies of men that they built, you know, in their struggle to obtain the resources. So there's this clear asymmetry where women perceive men as you know, basically the source of their resources, and also the source of all the problems in society, right? So there is this genuine, definite tendency for women to blame men for literally everything. Like, they never like they never acknowledge whatever they receive from men, but they tend to blame them for anything. And this is called hypoagency. So by default, whatever happens, a man is a perpetrator and a woman is a victim. Like, if a woman does some stupid stuff that leads to her suffering, it's the male fault always. Like the stupid evil men did not help her, did not prevent this from happening, whatever. It's a fairly prominent narrative in today's culture. And again, it connects to this basic biology and from there to the basic philosophy of gender, if you like. And I hope it's clear to you at the moment. Then there's a fairly prominent phenomenon of so-called in-group bias of women, where women essentially by default care for themselves, right? And I don't mean like on an individual level, like any woman cares for other women too. But the funniest thing is that men also care about women. Like men don't care about themselves. Like their purpose, and again, it's all predetermined biologically, is to serve women in some sense, right? Provide resources for them in exchange for obvious things, for reproduction, sex. Female approval is a huge motivational thing for any man. Like it's just cannot be overstated, like how important it is. So yeah, we have this very asymmetric situation where men provide all the resources and yet they are the least cared about, gender, which potentially might lead, to the downfall of the whole civilization if we're going to proceed, with our current peddling of feminism, etc. So men are inherently expendable, and again, it follows from basic biology. And women are inherently valuable, the golden uterus, vagina, whatever. So and men serve women, but women don't care about men. So you have this asymmetric relationship right here. And you also have what is called hypergamy, where, kind of returning to that process that I've described, where females enter the hierarchies of men, and they kind of tend to choose the best men, the best of these hierarchies. So there is a very prominent examples of that. Like even if you look at, again, I'm saying like it spans the whole space from basic philosophy to basic biology to the most like seemingly irrelevant layers of culture. Like for example, in modern dating apps, like Tinder, OkCupid, and whatever, you can see that an average woman only perceives like 20% of the top men as being kind of worthy, as being attractive enough, whereas an average man perceives half of all women, attractive enough. So you have this, again, asymmetry. It's very stark, I'm telling you. And okay, there are like obvious conclusions from that we can make towards divorce rates, and etc. But let's first look at the other examples of that. Like what's really prominent is that the same asymmetry, the same ratios are also observed at if we look at paleogenetics. Like for example, the mitochondrial DNA is inherited from women, right? Whereas Y chromosome only comes from men. So by analyzing those mitochondrial DNA versus Y chromosome, all the possible mutations, etc., we can in principle determine like what was roughly the ratio of men and women that give birth, gave, so to speak, a productive progeny, that whose genes were transferred into the next generations, basically. And you would see a pretty consistent picture, whereas, well, you can frequently find a number of like 1/2, but I'm more inclined to think about 1/4 is a much better estimate of how many, what is the ratio of men to women that give birth, that transferred their genes into the next generation. So it is roughly, if we look at ancient history, we'll say several thousand years ago, it is roughly 1/4. So of course some feminist activist might sound the alarm, like din 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 din, patriarchy alarm, fire in the hole. Like, what is that? Like, how is that one man gets 4 women, to produce children with? But think about the other side of that thing. Like, 3 men don't have any women, and they don't produce children at all. So is that patriarchy? I don't know. But even the more interesting thing is that as we move to Neolithic revolution, that was pretty much, the hunter-gatherer stage. But when we move to Neolithic revolution, when agriculture kicked in and it became possible to accumulate resources, essentially, this ratio skews just insanely to 1 per each 17, or about so. So 1 man were producing children with 17 women. Again, you can sound your patriarchy alarm, but it means that roughly 16 men out of 17 did not produce any children at all. They just died and disappeared. So it was quite harsh. But this is a good example of this, hypergamy. Whereas these men who were able to accumulate resources due to the appearance of agriculture, maybe they've had slaves or something. Slavery is inherently the product of agricultural civilization. And again, as Coltrane shows, for example, it is very characteristic that slavery was only abolished if we're talking about the USA, it's 1860s, when, industrialization kind of gained enough pace to get rid of the agricultural civilization. And the same thing happened in Russia, by the way, with the abolishment of serfdom in 1861, etc., etc. But sorry, I digressed so far. I can't even remember what I was talking about. Yeah, so we have this asymmetry, right? When women, through their hypergamous nature, choose the best man, and all the other men don't have access to reproduction at all. They just die out, right? So this is exactly the same type of dynamics following from basic biology. Okay, and the same ratio, by the way, roughly 1:4, 1 man per 4 women, is observed in modern hunter-gatherers and the other species like chimpanzees, etc. So it's a really natural thing, that's what I'm saying. And men are clearly victims of that. The absolute majority of men, like 80% of men, are not perceived as attractive by women, by the average woman, etc. Whereas half of women are perceived as attractive by an average man. Okay, and that all leads, this dynamic, this asymmetry leads to what is called Gynocentrism, the focus of the society, of the population on the problems of women. So women are the gender who we should satisfy, it's not vice versa. We should transfer the resources towards them. My previous video is pretty relevant in that regard. All the political implications we have from that. We should, tolerate all their whatever, all their nagging, whatever. We should please women. That's basically the whole point of the human society. And not only human society. It's again, as I've said, it follows from the basic biology. So we have this very asymmetric system, and it's even what's also interesting is that if you look at the criteria of attractiveness of men versus women, you would see that again women value this hierarchical status of a male, which in particular might be expressed in money, for example. So women look for the successful males, right? Whereas men don't care about that. Men don't care about money. I mean, how much money a woman makes, etc. So because they are the ones who are producing the resources, producing the money, and that leads to but they are very interested in, you know, reproductive capabilities of a woman. So we have this even difference in ages which are considered attractive. Like, for example, what TFM frequently mentions is that, you know, the female attractiveness window is roughly from, well, I don't know, from 16 to maybe 25, like the peak fertility ability, which also correlates to, you know, the peak attractiveness, essentially, because, well, what else is the attractiveness other than, you know, the indication of fertility? Whereas for men, like the peak attractiveness actually starts from somewhere in the 40s, I would say. You know, it peaks about maybe the age of 45. You know, what the ancient Greeks called acme, you know, the blooming, like the highest peak of a man's abilities, when he's already shown, and perhaps many times, that he is a good attempt at adaptation. You know, he is built very well into all these hierarchies. He has shown other men in particular that he is worthy, you know, and they respect him, and so on. So and that's pretty much when that thing peaks, basically, about, you know, the year 45, or maybe about so. So you have this very asymmetric age gap, I guess, like when young men worth nothing because, well, they have nothing, they don't have any money, they're not really trained to do anything, etc. So why would women like them, right? And vice versa, you know, older women, like, they can't have children. I mean, after 40, like, the best you can hope for is some, you know, degenerate child with like a whole bunch of genetic diseases and so on. So like, yeah, like after maybe 25, the chance of giving birth to like a really healthy child, it just very, very quickly drops. So yeah, so we see these pretty much asymmetric dynamics, but what happens in modern, you know, egalitarian society, or at least, you know, supposedly egalitarian, whereas, you know, in real life it's not quite, that you still have that necessity to satisfy women, which are which men are very actually, they actually consent to that, you know. I'm saying that there's this outgroup bias among men, where men actually agree to even die in literal sense in favor of women. I mean, again, this brilliant example of Coltrane, you know, Titanic movie, which shows that like it's considered okay for men to die just for, you know, to provide the ability to live for women. And that's why this is the most successful movie in all the history, if you take into account the inflation, obviously. Because it strikes this, you know, fundamental string in all of us, that this is really the case. This is how it should be. It looks completely natural. That's what I'm saying. You know, women and children first, that kind of thing. But if you keep insisting that we should have an egalitarian society, well, obviously you would encounter a problem. Like, why the hell all that should happen in the first place, right? And I think it should be stressed here that, for example, feminists, they're not about egalitarianism. They're not about equal rights. They're about privileges for women. They're not interested in getting rid of all the you know, all the positive things, so to speak, that women receive, you know, all the privileges they have. No. We should have more privileges. That's what they're saying. So it's like exactly the opposite of gender equality, and then it just underlines the basic, you know, I don't know, like basic hypocrisy of the modern society, I guess. that, you know, women are self-centered essentially, men are externally centered. Again, men are centered on women. In a way, you know, you can say that men are kind of off balance by default. You know, they're kind of going somewhere always. They always need to prove that they are worthy, etc. Again, men are human doings, not human beings. So I would say that I would even go as far as to say that a default value of a man in society is actually negative. So he, at first, at least in modern society, he should prove that he is at least not a bad person. It's, you know, whereas a woman is praised, etc., and her value is obviously very high by default. Again, just because she's a woman. And we have many of these problems right now. Like, for example, if you try to build an egalitarian society where you have really equal rights, right? Well, you would easily notice that, for example, women can't actually compete with men. Oh, I remembered, by the way, the thing I wanted to mention is that inherently men have, and it's been proven, you know, by studies, that men have wider distributions of parameters, right? So women's distributions of pretty much any parameter is narrower, right? So all the women are more like each other than all the men, so to speak. So in men, you have more outliers on both sides of any parameter, whereas women are more centered. That's why you would see more men, like say more very tall men and more very low men, low height, than women. Women are more centered. In statistical terms, and that is pretty much the case for all the other parameters. So, and this is one of the instruments how exactly men play this role of adaptation, right? They just have all the possibilities, all you know, at least as much possibilities as possible as a population, whereas those guys who don't fit into the current environmental conditions, they just die out, right? That's what happens. So, but nobody cares about them again. Like, and this is the fundamental injustice, I guess, of gender system. Like, men care about women and women care about women. Nobody cares about men. Like you're saying, okay, there's a lot of rich men. Like if you look at like the list of rich men, you would see, I mean, rich people, you would see almost exclusively men there, right? Well, guess what? Like if you look at the list of the absolute poverty, like the absolute poor people, also you would find they're mostly male, right? Etc. But somehow feminists tend to notice only one part of that issue, etc. And then you get all these brilliant, you know, statistics, like, you know, 19% of war journalists that were killed in 2017, according to the UN, are women. Like, really, it means like that 81% of all the world journalists that were killed were men, but who cares about them, right? Or 1 in 4 homeless people is a woman. Like, okay, well, it means that 3 of 4 homeless people are men, but who cares about them again? Like you keep hearing about, you know, female circumcision in Africa and Middle East is a horrible practice, which I agree with, by the way. But you mentioned, well, what about the male infant circumcision? And what would you hear? Only crickets, you know, nobody cares about it, etc., etc. Like, I don't know, like if you're a man, you have a much higher chance of being mugged and assaulted on the street. But somehow you only hear about women being mugged and assaulted on the street because, well, who cares about those men, right? And nobody cares. Like, really, I'm dead serious about it. Nobody cares. But is it the equality? Like you constantly hear about women getting raped by men, right? But if you look at the United States, for example, the majority of rape victims are men, you know, mostly thanks to the, you know, prison system, etc. But do you hear about that? Like maybe if more men are victims of rape, it's a bigger problem than, you know, the minority who are women. No, because, you know, it follows from basic biology that men don't matter, they're expendable. You can lose, again, 16 out of 17 men, as Neolithic revolution shows, and you'll be okay pretty much. So that's where our society is going, and it's completely natural, pretty much. That's what I'm saying. Okay, there's like literally thousands of examples of that, but I don't want to waste my time. It's already like 45 minutes, I don't know, something like that. So yeah, I've described, you know, the political implications in the previous video, you know, the rise of socialism and welfare state according to these, you know, basic dynamics of gender interaction, that women need to acquire resources that way or another, right? So and I believe that maybe, you know, modern socialism and big government, it might give women an illusion of independence from men, you know, because they're getting their resources from welfare, which means from anonymous bunch of men, basically, right? Who are getting, you know, ripped off by the government, and this money is getting redistributed to women. So it might give you an illusion that women depend on men. Oh, by the way, I've mentioned that the intelligence, it's a really interesting thing. Like I mean, speaking about gender differences, like it's pretty obvious that men are stronger than women, right? But what about the intelligence? So there's an interesting divergence, I guess. Like if you test people of the age of, let's say, 13 or 14, what you would see is the same picture that I've described before. Like women have a narrower peak, whereas, you know, men have wider distribution, but the average is the same, right? The average IQ, I mean. But the interesting thing that's getting missed frequently is that by the age of 16 or maybe 18, about so, what happens is that the men's distribution becomes narrower and it moves forward. So the average of male IQ is actually about 5 points higher than the average female IQ, if we're talking about adults again. So in children, it's the average is the same, it's just that men have wider distribution, right? Which we should pretty much expect. So some people explain that, like again, TFM, he thinks that the problem is that women reach puberty earlier, right? And this is, by the way, another digression. Like, this is another indication that females are, you know, about conservation, right? So female is already something that was tested many times before, and therefore you can reach puberty earlier and have children like right away, like from the age of 14, or I don't know. I mean, some cultures do that even to this day. Whereas a male is something new, dangerous, and therefore, you know, you should wait a little bit, you know, wait until all the roughnesses would disappear, you know, wait until he would socialize properly and again build himself into one of those hierarchies, etc. So I think this is also related to this basic contradiction of the genetic code, essentially. But so yeah, so one of the opinions of this of the reasons behind this gender difference in intelligence, in intellect, IQ, is that, well, males just reach puberty later, and therefore, you know, their proper distribution doesn't show up until, say, the age of 16 or 18. But I think there might be another factor here. Like, I really think that perhaps the literal die-off of, cynically speaking, stupid boys is what, you know, eliminates this lower part of the distribution, and the end result that you get is it crawls a little bit forward, you know, into higher IQ area. Because again, we know for sure that there are more boys than girls at the early stages, you know, at the age of 5 maybe, but they're pretty much equal at the age of 18. So one might hypothesize that it's exactly those, stupid, not really well adapted boys who are getting removed from the distribution, and the result is net increase in average IQ. But okay, yeah. So there. Well, I've talked a lot. I'm kind of tired already. But okay, just a couple of more points that I would like to make. Like, one of the things, this meme that gender is the social construct, and I would actually say that to a large degree it is. Like, if you don't have a society, a population, where the hell would you, remove this contradiction to? Like, you should have a society in order to have gender. Like, your computer should have a network to communicate with, to have an IP address, Otherwise, it's just not needed, right? An individual on its own, in a vacuum, doesn't need a gender, right? So gender is really like your role in this distribution of labor. It is your way of communicating to the overall gene pool of the whole population. And in that regard, I think we can say that even genitals, they're really only communication devices, essentially. They're the devices for transferring, receiving, and processing of genetic information, basically. So yeah, so your gender is really a way you relate to the population, a way you can talk to it in some sense, a way you can transfer your genetic information. That's what I'm saying. All right. And in that regard, yeah, I've kind of missed that point earlier, but I wish to return to it now, that it follows from what I've been saying previously, that there are only two genders, right? I'm sorry, all of my attack helicopter friends, but this is the case. And I believe I would make even stronger statement here, that all the, modern transgender people, whatever, all the anomalies, if you like, I would propose to call them actually male, because what happens is, with all these 30 extra genders, or how many they've invented already, is that, first of all, they are, well, they are something new, it's an attempt at adapting to the current environment, which is a male trait. And secondly, they are not sustainable, they wouldn't conserve. Like, you cannot transfer that to the next generation, which is also pretty much a male trait, if you consider that, the absolute majority of males, well, let's say their chances of getting their genes into the next generations are very small, basically. So yeah, I would propose to call all the extra genders male, and that's it. It would follow from, it would agree really well with all the basics of gender, and biological and philosophical. Yeah, and yeah, I think we should move more or less to the conclusions somewhere here. Like, I've probably missed a couple of points, but who cares? Like, I'm sure in the comment section somebody would remind me of something that I missed. That I believe that this problem, this gender issue, is one of the most important problems today, even though it might not look that difficult. But yeah, really, I mean, the way society has changed in literally last 50 years is just horrifying, like what kind of fruit we're reaping right now, from these changes in the environment, all our current post-industrial, heavily urbanized environment. It's completely unfit for, our previous adaptive strategies of, all of that which are described. Like, the gender roles are so prominent today. Like the men are oppressed so much, and the women are praised so much, and it becomes clearer and clearer that it's incompatible with this egalitarian agenda that we have, supposedly, at least. So yeah, it's a huge problem. And you know, some people again blame feminism for that, whereas I don't think feminism is the reason. I actually think feminism is the consequence, you know, of this basic biology and philosophy. It just highlighted that huge rift that was present always, but it tends to praise this rift essentially, rather than, you know, trying to make some egalitarian steps to, you know, I don't know, to care about men, basically, you know, or at least not, or at least to stop, you know, requiring more and more privileges for women, to kind of at least, you know, freeze it at a status quo or something to that effect. Whereas I don't know, all these examples just keep popping into my mind, like, you know, women actually live longer even though their, you know, retirement age is lower. It's just horrifying, like, yeah. So if you oppress men, like, who's gonna work? You know, you can have society where robots would do all the work, but you still need men to sustain robots, to engineer them, to, you know, invent something new, etc., etc. So yeah, it's a huge problem. And again, I've explored some of the political implications in my previous video, and I guess we should wrap up somewhere here. So yeah, I've spoke really enough about it. The eons are closing.